Running the bomb disposal circuit in a big boss rank playthrough is another instance where Raiden's efficiency could only be attributed to psychic abilities. I remember mixed reactions to the bomb disposal sequence, complaints that it was boring and, stuff like that. It's hard not to contextualize early gripes about MGS2 as dissatisfaction that the game isn't a perfect rehash of MGS1, and I still largely decode those complaints in that light. I've been really kind of interested in why people don't like the bomb disposal sequence, and so kind of in light of comparison with MGS1, I think there are a few reasons. First is the need to observe Big Shell's environment so much, and also how the design kind of takes Metal Gear Solid 1's backtracking design, but does not offer MGS1's sense of moving forward all the time. First-person perspectives were by no means alien on the PS1. One of the earliest games on the system, like Jumping Flash, showed off the possibilities of spatial depth on the PS1 right at the start by putting us in the perspective of a large robot rabbit shooting carrots and making you throw up. You could go into first person in MGS1, but that was only for observation and intrusion view. We might look around the tank building's armory for a discolored wall to detonate with C4 in first person, but we gather that information, in order to act in third person later. So making MGS2 a game where you could interact with the environment in first person was a step away from that older, entrenched design patterns and into some new shoes. We've already seen how the game uses this mechanic by allowing us to aim and shoot in first person, but the bomb disposal sequence takes us back to one of the ways that MGS1 used first person for gathering environmental information, when we were looking for those walls to bomb with a C4. Ironically, this time, instead of looking around for a place to place a bomb, we're looking for bombs to defuse, kind of flipping that on its head. We can't move in first person, and honestly thank God for that, given the first person VR missions. So the player experiences a lot of start, stop, look, move, while listening for audio cues, looking at the environment, checking the radar, and stuff like that. It doesn't feel as dynamic or exciting in the same way as MGS1 because the flow of our movement through each area stutters like that. And the trade-off there is that it introduces the challenge of, first, finding the bomb, and second, finding a place to situate Raiden long enough to defuse the bomb without getting seen by guards. That time that you're stuck in one place using the coolant can be kind of tense. And that's good, I think. It also more fully situates the player's headspace in the environment rather than mostly in a camera looking at the environment, although the radar does kind of diffuse that, and that's sort of a general design problem that MGS1 and MGS2 both sort of suffer from. That last point about the player's headspace being in the environment, it touches upon a thematic consequence of requiring us to go into first person so often as Raiden. Requiring the player to enter first person so regularly gets us virtually inside Raiden's head. It enforces identification, not merely with Raiden, but actually as Raiden, as an actor or a presence in that virtual world. Outside of first-person aiming, the tanker doesn't really require us to linger in first person like the bomb defusing sequence does, looking around using the coolant. So, we don't linger inside Snake's head the same way we're in Raiden's head. The overlap between player and character that Raiden ultimately refuses at the end of MGS2 is reinforced during the bomb disposal sequence. Kind of lays a groundwork there. Raiden belongs to us as a video game character, and in a sense we kind of belong to Raiden. That's an uncomfortable reciprocal relationship, I think, for a lot of players who really wanted to be Snake, because not only now can they not be Snake, but they actually have to more be the guy who they're forced to settle for instead of Snake. The flow of player progression is another reason why the bomb disposal sequence can feel off when we're expecting something like MGS1. Prior to MGS2, backtracking had always been part of Metal Gear's design, and a downhill of backtracking is that it can artificially extend overall gameplay time by padding out player progression with unnecessary quests to go back and get items or whatever. An upshot effect, though, is that it requires players to get more involved in the spaces that they need to traverse in the game. To my mind, complaints about backtracking through the fairly linear design of MGS1 are offset by the fact that players become intimate with the layout of the Shadow Moses facility, and this closeness helps to immerse players in the game's virtual space. MGS4 really highlighted this in Act 4, when we got to return to the much dilapidated Shadow Moses Island. First off, to my experience, it proved exactly how familiar I'd become with MGS1's virtual space, because in most places I knew exactly where I was in relation to other locations I couldn't access. Backtracking in MGS1 reinforced this. I'd built a kind of mental map of the virtual space, similar to the way I have like a mental map of my home or in the city where I live. If I'm in one room of my house, I know where I am in relation to places I can't see, and it's the same in MGS1. Second, MGS4 revealed, kind of almost shockingly, exactly how small the Shadow Moses facility actually is. MGS4 doesn't ask us to backtrack through Shadow Moses in order to complete Act 4, although, it does give a brief nod to that backtracking design when we unlock doors in the tank hangar after restoring power with the Mark III at the, near Otacon's lab. Anyway, Act 4 is a straight shot through the facility. It's comparatively much faster than MGS1, which I think it really underscores how much MGS1 made comprehensive use of such a small area. Kind of idiosyncratically, it makes me think of a solid poetic stanza. The word stanza, as some might know, is Renaissance Italian for little room. The implication is that a stanza is like a small focused space in which you put the right objects for function and beauty, and you arrange them in the best way possible. Not really a feng shui thing, but different. But maybe overlapping a bit, I don't know. Anyway, good level design is, to my mind, stanzaic because each space has potential use and makes every corner potentially relevant, and it's only as large as it needs to be. Backtracking requires us to literally enter and exit rooms from different sides, so the value of a level design is a crisscrossing affair. The virtual space means something different when traversed in one direction as opposed to another, and we encounter different guards. In Metal Gear, we encounter different guards or the same guards that pose different challenges, depending on which way we're coming from. So the virtual space has to be meaningful in the same way that a good poetic stanza can be read in different ways, and it can be re-understood as artfully ambiguous language that requires us to hold several different potential meanings in our minds at the same time, without always necessarily eliminating one meaning because it contradicts another. Really, that contradiction is what I think makes it good, and it seems relatable to being able to find new challenges moving one way through a game's virtual space as opposed to moving through it in another. MGS2 enhances that backtracking effect of MGS1 by designing each room in just that stanzaic way. Backtracking in MGS1 mainly ushered us back and forth through the facility, while we often accessed individual rooms in the same way. We needed to make repeated trips to the armory below the tank hangar, for instance, and we always did so from starting at the elevator and exiting through the elevator. Even there, though, there is still some variation, because you're not always going to the same little kind of locker bunker for items as on one trip as you will on the other. So, the PSG-1's in a different place than the FAMAS, however you pronounce that. And so that's a different kind of challenge. There's also the smelting room, with like the memory card alloy, and you have to use those spaces in different ways in order to be there long enough to change the temperature. So it still has that quality to it. During the bomb disposal sequence, though, we have to inhabit the big shell by getting to know each space back and forth. It kind of changes the level design of MGS1 into an endlessly repeating, self-enclosed circle rather than a straight shot from beginning to end. And because there's a thematic overlap between the experience of Big Shell and Raiden's own consciousness, the looping nature of the Big Shell's design can be understood, I think, as a representation of how much Raiden is caught up in the Solid Snake myth stoked by Snake's reputation as a one-man anti-Metal Gear legend. The next bomb is really challenging. It, more than the others, requires you to find a place to wait that isn't really secure. At least if there was a secure place, I never found it. I was able to obscure myself from any of the guards in order to stand in the open while waiting for the bomb to arrive on one of the conveyor belt packages, and you really need to catch it on the first pass, because any guards that you put to sleep if you choose to do so will usually wake up before it cycles back through. The position here in this playthrough was particularly good because I can see which package the bomb's attached to, and I can start spraying the coolant in order to begin freezing it the very second that it's within range. I also found that if I was a little slow on the draw, I could also finish the job if I kept spraying even once it passed me. The coolant will actually still affect the bomb even if the crate has its backside to you. Back on the point about level design and theme, though. The level design is kind of a matter of closed identity. Raiden's caught in a cultivated myth that reaffirms itself with every call to the AI kernel, Rose, and the boss fights, all of it which the game calls the S3 plan. Snake as Pliskin is an external factor not accounted for by the Patriots when they built the myth and the VR regimen that Raiden inhabits and keeps playing through. If we view level design as a thematic device, then I think it's appropriate that while the player and Raiden are getting close to each other, as the same consciousness in the game world, Snake occupies the other half of Big Shell, removed from Raiden's circular identity, but speaking to him from outside. This external communication helps Raiden to kind of break out of that induced psychosis, that sort of hypnotic mold that he's been put into. And I think it's doubly appropriate that Raiden recognizes Snake as Snake, which helps him make the first step away from continuing to perform Snake's identity. He recognizes Snake as Snake during the Harrier battle on the connecting bridge, which is the exact moment that Raiden physically leaves the cyclical first half of the Big Shell. So he's breaking out of that loop in terms of character and also physically in the environment. So the bomb disposal sequence is a foundation for the changes that are introduced as the game goes on and develops. None of that could play out as forcefully as it does if the game had not created a starting form that it then breaks in a thematically significant way. I don't usually address this, and I probably won't ever again, but I'll do it here. I'm interested in some of the pushback that I encountered after Driving Off the Map went live. For reference, that pushback consisted of some mild personal harassment and disproportionately outraged responses on message boards, and the perception was that my interpretation of the game was kind of pretentious and unfounded and consequentially insubstantial. And pretense, of course, consists of somebody speaking out of their depth or in a self-important manner, which is kind of a misguided interpretation because honestly this is my element, among several others. That kind of haranguing only really stopped when I was designated an MGS2 expert on the studio's Kojima Productions Report back in, I believe, 2008, which I think quelled a kind of suspicion toward imaginative interpretation as unauthoritative or bunk. I don't really ever talk about the design team's intentions. If a thing is made well, honestly, those intentions really shouldn't even matter. To my aesthetics, if we need some outside interview to find meaning in a created thing, then that created thing is probably not well made. Each part should be relatable to the other parts, and the creation should be interpretable to a degree by information that it also provides. Obviously, you're going to come at it from outside with values and moral systems and that sort of thing, but you should have a stable, cohesive object to apply those to. And honestly, none of us ever really borrow our values from a creator. We always take those to it on first experience. Otherwise, we would have just looked at an interview before we encountered the thing and said, okay, these are the values I'm going to apply to what I'm about to experience. And no one does that. And if you do, no offense. So what this does then is it gives room for imaginative engagement with the content. It also diffuses the illusion of an objective interpretation, which is really a contradiction in terms, since we can only make meaning out of the details that we select, consciously or otherwise, and then choose to correlate. I've noticed a lot of distrust toward imaginative responses to created work, and that distrust can come from a number of places, which I don't claim to know what all of them are, but I can speculate. Whether it's mistaking imaginative responses for opinions, believing that responsible interpretation doesn't exist, which is kind of like, it's kind of the mistake of recognizing that interpretation and opinion both fall under the general category of subjective assessment, but mistaking them for the same thing. One can inform the other, and they certainly do, but they're not. One is certainly more rigorous and external looking, and the other one is more compulsive, maybe more emotionally driven. Anyway, also hand-waving abstractions away, and also hand-waving symbolic communication as untrustworthy or as bullshit, or by simply lacking the kind of imagination that lends itself to abstraction, and that latter factor is fine, I think. We're each prepared to encounter ideas presented to us in ways most accessible to our frames of reference. Less generously, there's a suspicion of interpretation as untrustworthy, perhaps because someone can't find a way to verify the truth of an interpretation, and maybe they want or need some way to verify ideas before they can trust them. And authorial statements provide that kind of verification. That's why, the word authoritative has author in it. So I think that's why some people prefer that over an imaginative response. Really, there's an irony there, given video games' much lauded interactive quality. Concrete interaction is prized as grounds for encouraging player agency, greater variety of decision-making, and so on. But this actually is limited to the game as an immediate experience. You're not making decisions in a game when you're not playing a game. Imaginative interaction, which is what a video game can mean to us apart from interacting with the game manually or spatially, is subject to some distrust, even though imaginative interaction is, kind of to my mind, even one of the main reasons we engage in imaginative creation at all. So, looking for truth in the imagination is unstable territory, and it can be upsetting sometimes, but, that's really the risk and the thrill, and also the experience itself is the reward of that kind of engagement. Well then, back to this. Heading for the final bomb in Euro Extreme isn't too difficult, especially if you removed certain obstacles on your first cycle through the big shell. I picked up chaff grenades on my first time across the BC connecting bridge on the way to the first cutscene with Stillman, but I'm choosing not to use them here because I think they're better used when I need to move quickly through an area with a lot of cameras, whether they're static or attached to ciphers. So in this case, I think it's just simpler to shoot the one that's there and then make my way across. As I recall, they're rare enough to want to save for the rush into arsenal gear near the end of the plant sequence. You might have noticed while I was monologuing that I shot out the cameras in this hallway before, so I don't have to deal with the guards the second time through in the adjacent room. Again, the time counter for getting to the final bomb is large enough, there's no problem there, especially since, it's Euro Extreme, you're not trying to get your bearings anymore, you know what's going on, it's just simply a matter of strategy and execution. And on that point of strategy and execution, you actually just saw something important about crossing these connecting bridges. Guards can see Raiden better in light than in shadow, I think, which is why I ran to the wall, pressed against it, and then took aim at the guards. While experimenting to develop my strategy for a big boss run, I found that they kept noticing Raiden whenever I stood in the sunlight. So pressing against the wall is a great way to get Raiden facing the direction I want without needing to tap the analog stick in that direction. Because if I'd tapped the analog stick in that direction to orient Raiden, I'd have risked stepping into the sunlight. Taking the elevator back down is a really interesting decision to me from the point of view of the Metal Gear games up to this point. While there's a lot of backtracking in the games, you don't ever really need to backtrack to your point of origin, and in fact even in MGS1 you can't. It's that return to a beginning that's just never really emphasized outside of MGS2. It's kind of like returning to childhood, back to your beginnings, given that your beginnings were a century-laden loading dock full of explosives? What? Even considering that the soldiers might have rearranged the loading dock for practical purposes in the interim between Raiden's arrival and his return here, my very first time playing this I thought, wow, that's really symmetrical! I'm really glad someone else has a sense of balance and proportion. Which turned out it was another way of saying, I'm super glad this level design implies a character with efficiency-reducing OCD. It makes you feel like you have a people. And we are on the threshold of the first true test of MGS2 endurance. I think I placed my first save right after Raiden made it to the top of the elevator at the start of the plant chapter, and I think I put my second save somewhere around here, because it's that tough. Fat Man might have been the Patriots' way of testing Raiden for the efficacy of the S3 plan, but this is actually Euro Extreme's first Hell Gauntlet. Part of this fight's design echoes the fight against Olga during the Tanker chapter, but unlike the Olga fight, your cover is only slightly more durable than your hero. I prefer to have Fortune strip this level of anything that remotely suggests safety right from the start, because that safety is an illusion. I let her shoot through the initial cover, and the rest of the fight hinges upon three things. 1. Getting down the rhythm of her double tap with the rail cannon. 2. Learning the flow of this fight's script since it's time-based. And 3. Learning how to get the game to make sure Raiden rotates away from Fortune's direction toward the camera when you change directions on the D-pad. That last point sounds a little weird, but it was the capstone of my being able to really beat Fortune at all. Jumping out of the way of Fortune's projectiles requires running horizontally across the screen, right? So if you're running diagonal to the bottom edge of the level, you risk flipping into the wall. When you flip into the wall, that doesn't knock Raiden down, but instead it leaves him stationary during the somersault animation, and he will almost certainly take a bullet when he gets stuck like that. So you absolutely need to be running either perfectly left or perfectly right. And this requires the D-pad rather than the analog stick. When you change directions using the D-pad, the game will sometimes have Raiden turn 180 degrees toward the camera or away from the camera when he rotates. It seems to remember which way Raiden rotated when you turned around last, so I found that success, for me, during this fight, weirdly depended upon the minutiae of training the controls to automatically rotate toward the camera rather than away when I made my next trip across the level. If he rotates away from the camera, he runs just slightly closer to Fortune and the other obstacles in the level, and you need to hug that back wall to successfully dodge her bullets without getting hung on the barrels. I always made sure that my last 180-degree turn before starting to move back and forth rotated Raiden toward the camera rather than away from it, and that sort of synchronized him for that movement for the rest of the fight. There's no time for nuanced movements when you're turning around to make it to the other side once Fortune is shooting at you with no cover, so you absolutely need the game to keep you hugging that back wall when you turn around for the next pass. And I'm now on my way to that first test of the Patriots. I had a timer escort me here, and I've got a timer to escort me out. What you're seeing here is mostly a lot of rehearsal for enemy placement and shooting and that sort of thing. It can be frustrating once you've just started getting the Fortune fight down, mainly because it's only a good idea to save again after the Fat Man fight, which can result in a lot of repeats for the Fortune sequence. You need to pace yourself on saves for MGS2, since this isn't like the Caribbean island vacation that the Foxhound rank on MGS3 is. It's actually much stricter, and for that, in a way, kind of more rewarding, I think. Here's an example of what I mentioned before. I need to make my way across this bridge quickly, and there are a lot of ciphers with cameras around, and guns to boot. Rather than take the time to shoot them individually, it's much more effective to throw a chaff grenade and then sprint across the bridge while they're disoriented.
There's somebody there.